A very warm welcome to my channel, War Chronicle. It's my goal to bring you the most epic stories from human history, and this one is no exception. Today we'll be taking a look at the largest tank battle since World War II, when over 200 tanks clashed near the Indian border town of Chawinda. On September 9, 1965, Pakistani armor charged across the international border into India with orders to seize the town of Aminder. The conflict began in the disputed territory of Kashmir, which both nations had laid claim to. The plan was simple. Once the Pakistani offensive stalled, the Indian army would counterattack at multiple points and drive them back. This would force Pakistan to commit more and more resources to defending their gains, eventually collapsing their entire front line. Major H.S. Doon, the commanding officer of the battalion, quickly organized his men into defensive positions, forming a loose battle line with his 3 companies along a ridge overlooking the valley below. This unexpected victory boosted morale and inspired other units to fight even harder. Meanwhile, Pakistan's Western Command was furious. Once again, Pakistani armor was advancing too far into the kill zone, allowing the defenders to inflict heavy casualties. Throughout the night, sporadic fighting continued. But by dawn, the Pakistani forces were forced to pull back. Seeing an opportunity to deal a decisive blow to the enemy, Aurora ordered the remaining 40 Shermans from the 4th Cavalry to support the exhausted 1st Battalion, 4th Maratha Light Infantry. Of the 40 tanks committed to the battle group, 15 had already been knocked out. Only one of their Sherman tanks was still operational. With their backs against the wall, the Indian soldiers fought fiercely, repelling attack after attack. But they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. By noon, every single Indian tank had been knocked out. But amazingly, the battle group still held. Although they were now on foot, the men of the 1st Battalion fought alongside their comrades from the 4th Cavalry, driving the enemy back from the village. And with ammunition running low, it seemed that the Indian forces might not be able to hold out much longer. The battle was over. The Indian forces had won a stunning victory, inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy and securing the border towns. For the Indian forces, it was a resounding triumph. But for the Pakistani forces, it was a devastating defeat. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. The Battle Group S stand at Chawinda had bought valuable time for the Indian army to regroup and launch its own counterattack. It was the turning point of the war and paved the way for India's victory. In total, the Indian forces had knocked out over 150 tanks and 400 other vehicles, while suffering only a fraction of those losses themselves. To make matters worse, Pakistani infantry began to exploit the gap in the Indian lines, threatening to flank the defenders. Realizing that he couldn't hold out much longer, Brigadier Digby ordered his remaining tanks to charge the enemy position. Together, the 2 units formed the Battle Group Digby, named after its commander, Brigadier Mohammed Usman. They ordered the 1st Punjab Regiment stationed in Lahore to relieve the beleaguered forces in Chawinda at all costs. The Punjabis wasted no time in preparing for their counterattack. But before they could join the fray, they too came under heavy fire from Indian artillery. Again, only a handful of vehicles remained, which made their way to Bomni to reinforce their comrades. There, the 45 tanks dug in alongside the 5 from the first wave, forming a nearly impenetrable wall of steel. Over the next few days, they gathered all available armor and infantry, forming a massive armored spearhead consisting of 22 Sherman tanks, 200 other armored vehicles, and 6 infantry companies. Their mission: recapture Chawinda at any cost. The plan was to keep the Pakistani forces pinned down until reinforcements arrived. Soon enough, the enemy advanced through the narrow streets of Chawinda, unaware that they had walked right into an ambush. On the morning of September 10th, as the sun rose over the Indian Punjab, the 2 sides clashed in the largest tank battle since World War II. The Pakistani counterattack came in 2 waves. The first wave consisted of 22 Shermans supported by infantry. But it was soon decimated by the accurate fire of the Indian artillery and the 1st Battalion. Before long, only 5 of the 22 Pakistani tanks were still operational. These 5 managed to reach the village of Bomni, where they dug in and awaited the arrival of the second wave. At around 4 p.m., as the first Pakistani vehicles emerged from the town, the Indian soldiers opened fire. The Pakistani column, consisting of 4 Sherman tanks, 3 armored personnel carriers, and several other vehicles, was caught completely by surprise. Within minutes, all 8 tanks were destroyed, along with the other vehicles. Some were knocked out by anti-tank missiles, while others were finished off by the men on the ground using rocket launchers or grenades. But the problem was that the Indian military was woefully underprepared for war. They had a peacetime army of only 500,000 men, almost half the size of their Pakistani counterpart. They also had far less armor, about a third of Pakistan's 2,000 tanks. With the Indian army stretched thin across the border, it was unlikely that they could hold off the Pakistani advance much longer without committing their strategic reserves, so time was of the essence. Clashes between the two had been constant since 1947. The situation escalated after Pakistan launched Operation Gibraltar in April 1965, attempting to infiltrate Kashmir and spark a popular uprising against Indian rule. On September 8th, the Pakistani forces reached the outskirts of Amritsar. If the town fell, the rail line connecting Delhi to the rest of the country would be cut, severely limiting India's ability to reinforce its troops along the border. The Indian commander, Lieutenant General Jagat Singh Arora, realized that he needed to act fast to stop the Pakistani advance. He ordered the 1st Battalion of the 4th Maratha Light Infantry to halt the enemy's progress at all costs. The soldiers raced to the front in trucks, desperately trying to get some sleep before the coming battle. Indian forces were prepared for this, however, and inflicted heavy casualties on the Pakistani infiltrators. Pakistani leadership, angry over the setbacks and seeing an opportunity to finally settle the dispute once and for all, decided to launch a full-scale invasion. On September 1st, 1965, Pakistani forces crossed the international border in multiple locations, aiming to capture several key points. While the main thrust of the attack was aimed at Amritsar, other forces pushed towards the towns of Atari, Boha, Jessore, and Kem Karan, forcing Indian troops to split their already limited resources between multiple fronts, which sat just 25 miles from the border and contained an important rail line that could supply Indian forces. They planned to capture the town before Indian reinforcements could arrive. But what they didn't know was that India had been expecting them. As the Pakistani armored columns approached, Indian troops opened fire. A company of 30 Sherman tanks hidden in the tall grass opened fire at point-blank range and destroyed many of the leading Pakistani vehicles. Other Indian forces harassed their flanks while infantry secured key crossroads. By the end of the day, the Pakistani advance had been stopped, and their plans to relieve pressure from their comrades in Kashmir were thwarted. This small victory would lead to the biggest tank battle since World War II. But first, why were these two great powers at war? In response to the growing threat, Indian Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri met with his top military commanders to discuss a counterattack to push the Pakistani forces back across the border. As Indian troops struggled to contain the Pakistani onslaught, things began to look bleak. When they arrived at the village of Chawinda, now known simply as Chawinda, the soldiers found that the enemy had already entered the town. News of the Indian success at Chawinda quickly spread throughout the front lines. On September, the Punjabis attacked, but they were again repelled by the defenders. What happened next was nothing short of spectacular. The second wave consisted of 45 additional tanks, including M24 Chaffee, M4 Sherman, and M3 Stuart, and several armored cars. By this time, the Indian troops had suffered heavy casualties. At around 9 a.m., as the smoke cleared, the Indians found themselves on the verge of total annihilation. But with their armor destroyed and their infantry routed, the Pakistani forces took advantage of the confusion and fled. The Battle of Chawinda remains the largest tank battle since World War II and one of the most lopsided victories in military history. Now I want to hear from you guys. What do you think of the Battle of Chawinda? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.